The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Voices in Validation. We've talked about data integrity many times on previous episodes, but this week we're going to talk about hidden issues and blind spots. And I am happy to introduce to you Dr. Siegfried Schmitt to help us do that. Welcome, Siegfried.
Thank you, Stacey. Welcome to you and welcome to the audience.
Yeah, it's so great to have you here. You have such a breadth of knowledge in this area. And it is a topic that we know our audience is concerned with daily, data integrity. And there are specific data integrity expectations for any organization involved in any aspect of pharmaceutical life cycle. Specific guidances can be vague, and there seems to be some confusion over many different aspects, whether it's systems and processes, which need to be included in your data integrity program, when data actually becomes data, who exactly is responsible for oversight, and many more. So can you kick us off with a little guidance in this area?
Certainly. So, yes, there is a lot of information available, and there are a series of regulations and guidances, for example, from PICS, EMA, so the European Medicines Agency, the UK's MHRA, or US FDA. And yes, although there isn't a lot of overlap between these regulations and guidances, there are also differences. For example, all of them cover the good manufacturing practices, but not all do cover good clinical practice, for example. So therefore, companies need to identify a few things, and that includes which regulations and guidances are applicable to their type of operations. So is it just the GMP or maybe also the GCP? Then which of the processes and systems are governed by these regulations or guidances? And lastly, which data are then managed within these processes and systems? So that clearly shows the need for companies to have what? To have all processes documented, preferably as process flow charts, because that makes it most easy to follow. And once you've got your process flows, you also need to map your data. As you see, data may not just be handled within one system, but potentially within several or many systems and going through several processes. So perhaps it's best illustrated with an example. If you take, for example, an analytical result for a batch, mapping the data for this analytical result will help a company identify what data exists in which system and help them identify what, for example, are the raw data or what are the records. Okay, so this is really a start for the company to understand both processes and data.
So it would be beneficial, obviously, to the organization to have written rules around these two areas, or their own guidelines, right? You have to lay out your expectations for your team, obviously. I think one of the blind spots for reviewers or regulatory folk coming in can be that now you have all of this data, and it exists in all of these different spots. But the ability of data reviewers to fully reconstruct the conduct of the GXP activity, whatever it is, in the original electronic data sets is a misconception that electronic data is not GXP data until it's permanently recorded. Am I correct?
That is correct. And I would say it's also correct for paper records, not just the electronic records.
Sure.
So let us look at a typical case with electronic data first. So say an instrument is used to analyze a sample. Then the data may first reside on the analytical instrument before it's been transferred to, say, a data management system. And I have seen cases where there was no or insufficient control over the instrument and the transfer. And this is exactly because the company believed only the permanent record on the data management system would be GXP data. And only there, data integrity measures must be fully applied, which of course is a misconception here. And let me also give you an example perhaps for a paper record. So I have seen, for example, an HPLC result being printed out. 98.7% area. And then this result would have been manually entered into a laboratory information management system. Now, the process as such is not wrong. You can do it like this, but there was no validation for the printout, nor was there a second check for the manual entry. So the blind spot was to believe in the printed result from the HPLC, assuming that, well, if I can see the result electronically online, then the printed result has to be the same, of course. And this is where it sometimes is not correct.
How would there be a discrepancy between what you're looking at? I mean, just to describe that a little bit in more detail for our listeners, right?
Yes.
So you're looking at your screen and you see the electronic result. You're going to print it. Talk about what can go wrong there.
Very well, yes. So let's say the display on the HPLC is 98.7% area. Then the printout still shows 98.7% area. Now, when I enter this into the LIMS system, the LIMS may be set up to show 2 digits after the comma. So although I enter 98.0, what effectively shows up in the LIMS is 98.70 area percent, which is not the same as what we in fact obtained from the HPLC. So, and these sort of things can happen. It's not just manually, it's also electronically. The case I mentioned previously, where the transfer from the instrument to the data management system occurred electronically. Again, what happened was that the transfer software averaged data. And when you compared the data that you saw on the HPLC and the data you saw finally in the data management system, they differed in the positions after the comma. And although it may not have an effect on whether the product could be released or not, from a data integrity perspective, if the data differ, they are not the same.
Right. Okay. Understood. So this is where it's very important to have some sort of system or process in place where you're double checking that information, both as it's coming out of your electronic system and again, as it's going back into your records management system, correct?
Absolutely correct. And that check should be preferably electronic rather than manual.
Right. Okay. Sure. That makes sense. So you mentioned data integrity applies not just to electronic records, but also to handwritten records. which makes perfect sense. But it makes me wonder, what about informal notes? If you're doing some bench testing and you're jotting down things on your notepad, your steno book, whatever, or you're at an offsite meeting and you have some sort of ideas, or you have a quick brainstorming session with colleagues at the water bubbler. I'm just thinking of all the different scenarios. How do you record? I mean, what about that data? Where does that go?
Indeed, very realistic scenarios that you mentioned here. So as long as no quality impacting decisions are made based on that documented evidence, it could be a piece of scrap paper, this is not a problem.
Okay.
But let me give you some example what I saw where such a situation was handled incorrectly. So the situation was we have a manufacturing plant and the light was not so good enough in there to see the item number on the filter cartridge. So the operator wanted to has to record that number. So the operator went to another place which was better lit, takes a piece of paper, documents the number, goes back into the plant to the batch record and enters the number in the batch record. So far, all correct. Well, mostly.
Mostly.
What the person did not do was to retain the piece of paper on which this number was first recorded. So, you see, we are losing the trail of the documentation. And if at least this piece of paper had been retained, then we would have had less of a data integrity issue.
Sure. So you have to keep all of the pertinent information so you can go back and double check it. If something goes wrong, you need to know where you went astray. And again, those are, just developing those systems and processes within your own in company or organization. And we've talked about that a couple of times already during this episode. So let's assume we have the correct standard operating procedures for data integrity in place. That's a great start for us as a company. I hear often, though, where a company or a team of people don't adhere to those or don't fully adhere to those processes, which are already clearly documented. So help us understand where we go astray when that kind of thing happens.
Well, you're absolutely right. Companies do train their staff, and there are great training programs. There are the SOPs, and still things aren't always right. And I think there are several factors that influence that. One is an overload of SOPs with too much text and not enough process flows, so it can be difficult to remember things. And then the language can also often be a little bit confusing. Let me give you again an example that could probably highlight this a little bit better. For a clinical trial, the team was perfectly well trained in data integrity. And so what happened was, it's about timely recording. So data integrity requires you record in a timely manner. So what I've seen was that a medical doctor recorded that he saw the patient at 10 in the morning. The nurse recorded that the patient was seen at 20 minutes past 10 in the morning, and the ECG printout showed a timestamp of 30 minutes past 8 in the evening. So when talking to the team, everyone thought they had done the right thing. But in fact, only the nurse was doing everything right, because the nurse documented the time when she saw the patient. The doctor documented from memory in the evening that he thought he saw the patient at that time. And with the instrument, the issue was a low battery. which meant that the clock was slow and nobody had bothered to check. So none of these activities were done wrong on purpose. And of course, the SOP didn't say, please go and check the ECG machine for low battery. And of course, the SOP didn't say, dear doctor, don't record from memory in the evening because you can never remember everything.
Sure.
And so this is the problem with SOPs. You cannot write everything down, but please keep your eyes open for issues.
And right. And of course, we should all do our best to do that. But sometimes we get busy in our day, right? Or we miss things that are right in front of us. I mean, we're all guilty of missing things. Certainly in your example, that process can be modified or corrected so that that doctor is recording on the spot, whether it's his initials on a document or, that can be put into the system later, I would assume, as long as that first piece is done correctly, the documentation is correct.
Absolutely. And what it also shows is that people are not wanting to do things wrong, but sometimes the circumstances, the technologies aren't just the best in place. See, paper, yes, we're used to documenting on paper, but then we have to transcribe things often into automated systems. And if we had, for example, a tablet in the first place, so we didn't have to write things down on paper, but could record it straight away like this, then this would, even for a medical doctor, be no problem to use then.
Right. And you're going to get the most accurate records.
Indeed.
Right. Because they're recording exactly what they're doing, when they're doing it. It's time stamped correctly, assuming there's no low battery.
Indeed.
So it's better for the patient, better record keeping. So great. I feel like we can also miss things. So that's a great example of just a process that needs to be tightened up. But sometimes the processes are very strong and still we miss things. We may become blind to our own environment, if you will. And we're just used to seeing what we see. And so we miss some of those things that are right in front of us. And I know I've heard you talk about that before. So when data integrity is involved, it seems that awareness should be heightened, but it's not always the case. So we're guilty of turning the blind eye or just completely missing it. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that happens and how we can sort of prevent that or set ourselves up differently so that doesn't happen?
Yes. It's simply a fact that it doesn't matter whether it's your work life or your private life. We just get used to seeing things. We no longer see that the paint is fading on the wall because it's a gradual thing, or we don't necessarily see that someone is using a piece of scrap paper when they shouldn't. It's just that we focus on what we feel is important. And because it's simply a fact of human thinking, the way we simply behave and think, we just have to accept that. So what companies do to be sure they don't fall into these traps is they ask outsiders, and by outsider I mean just someone who isn't involved in the daily business of what you're doing. It can be from the same company but a different department, for example, to come and look at what you're doing. Or it could be an external consultant, whatever, to just come in and look. And it's just then that people see things with completely different eyes. And this is when things like the examples I mentioned before come out. As I said, it's not because people don't want to see it, they simply don't.
Right. And that makes sense. And I love the idea of just having a third party, someone who's more objective, come in and just do a series of checks and balances. Might be able to open our eyes to something that's going on that we clearly don't see anymore. So great fix for that. I hear a lot. I mean, while we're on the topic of data integrity, right? We're hearing a lot. I know it's a hot topic. It's not new, but it's one of those things that we hear about a lot in the news, because there are findings all the time by regulatory agencies in companies all over the world. And some of them are being found to really just be doing bad things, like falsifying data, et cetera. And it doesn't seem to me like anyone who's working in pharmaceutical or med device or, some life science based company would intentionally set out to do the wrong thing or purposely cause harm. Yet we are still hearing these things daily. So can you talk a little bit about how these kinds of violations occur and the scenarios that lead up to them?
Yes. Unfortunately, we normally hear about the bad things and not about the good things. That's one thing. But now, talking to many people in industry and also regulators, there is sort of a consensus that about only 5% of all data integrity violations that get discovered are willful, are really falsifications because people know what they're doing and they want to do it wrong, and they do it wrong. Mm-hmm. And that perhaps as a first thing to say. But then the next thing is, I have never seen a case of willful falsification where management hadn't either been aware or they were actively involved. In most cases, it was actually management who ordered the falsification. And you see, people do not normally get up in the morning and think to themselves, right, today I will falsify this record, this analysis result. I will falsify. No, they don't do that. Okay.
I think that's fair to say, Siegfried.
But you see, what happens is that in many cases where these falsifications were noted, people simply didn't have the time to do their work correctly. They didn't have the tools, or someone wanted to hide some facts. And you could ask yourself, is it always for personal gain? Well, no, I have seen cases of absolute idiocy, total stupidness. Oh. So I'm afraid we're just humans. So people do things because they're stupid sometimes, not just because they profit from it.
Right. And that does happen. And so when it's a case of just bad decision making or not paying attention, whatever, management obviously needs to be made aware and get involved. And how do you see management working what's their role in cases like this where the integrity of the data has in fact been compromised? And what's the best fix from the management perspective for something like that?
Yes. Now, they need to investigate without a doubt. But let me say, this can be an issue in itself because, you see, data integrity, it's often only an allegation that there has been misconduct, that there has been falsification. It's not necessarily a factual case with an obvious deviation that you normally find in industry. The machine didn't go wrong. Perhaps someone is saying, well, I think this person is not recording correctly or not recording at all what they should be recording. So these investigations can be a bit difficult and tricky, and it may be necessary to include human resources. It may be necessary to include independent investigators to get to the bottom of these issues. I've seen such investigations being conducted, and they can be highly emotional because people feel personally attacked. Oh, you accuse me of falsification. So in the end, senior management simply has to take responsibility for whatever happens in the company And yes, they need to investigate. That's the key thing.
Of course. Are there things as leaders, though, that they can do to circumvent this kind of thing? I mean, I think one thing obviously is to train your staff well and often, but what else can be done?
Well, absolutely good question, because many companies have implemented, it could be an email address, it could be a phone number that anyone can call anonymously, absolutely anonymously. And it's often just a third party legal office where people can say, look, I really believe something's not right. And so if they can do this, as I say, anonymously, then a lot of the stress is already taken out of such an investigation, because then it can be done in an unbiased way. It can be done in the correct formal manner. And see, what sometimes is missing in companies is a process where there is feedback provided. Because some of the worst things I believe that can happen is there is an accusation made and there is no communication. Is this being investigated? Has anything been found? Are any measures being taken or not? So you don't want to be left in the dark after that. And these processes, they work very well, but it's not implemented everywhere.
Sure. And of course, we're going to continue to see issues like this arise because the process isn't correct or hasn't been updated, or someone simply hasn't been trained on it appropriately. And recognizing that, Siegfried, we're just about to wrap up for the day, but I think it is so important to help our listeners be the best that they can be with this information. So can you leave our listeners with a couple of strategies or tactics for identifying quickly some of these hidden issues that we've talked about today and doing something to correct it or to improve their chances today? What can they do today?
Yeah, so data integrity is a highly complex issue, absolutely no doubt. And so no one should expect to be fully compliant with everything immediately. And even the very big companies say, well, we don't believe we're 100% compliant, but we're doing our best. So what companies really need to do is to take a risk-based approach to make sure that the high-risk parts are addressed first before you try to address all and everything. And then have someone unrelated to your operations come and audit you, because this way you will avoid bias. So I hope that helps.
I think so. Absolutely. So prioritize, right? So you know where your highest risk lies. And I love the idea of just doing an audit, but it doesn't have to be. A lot of people think of an audit as a regulatory agency coming in and, oh my gosh, my whole staff's going to go crazy. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can have an independent company come in and take a look for you. You can do an internal audit too, as I understand, just to
absolutely
double check.
Absolutely correct. Yes.
Right. Excellent. Well, I think those are two great suggestions that our listeners can take away today. Siegfried, I want to thank you so much for being here with us and sharing all of your knowledge today. It's been amazing having you. And to our listeners out there, if you have questions, we will have links in the show notes for places that you can send emails or ask for clarifying documents. But again, thank you to Siegfried for being with us today. Thank you to our producer, Ed Sullivan, and to Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share it with your friends and colleagues, because that's how we grow, and we do appreciate your help with that. You can find out more by visiting ivtnetwork.com. And another great episode of Voices in Validation is coming at you next week. So we'll see you then.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.